beings are social creatures, but there are times where loneliness is real, even when people are all around you. Jimmy has the story. Jimmy?
What does it mean to be lonely? Members of different age groups might have different definitions or different ways of measuring exactly what loneliness is and how it affects each of them. In reading the title of this article, my mind immediately went to social media. By the way, the article is titled 19% of US adults report frequently or always feeling lonely. But yeah, my mind went straight to social media, and it was not surprising that this topic appeared as the most likely cause for young people to feel lonely, while elderly report little loneliness at all. So, why the huge differentiation? We'll discuss the breakdown of loneliness in the United States and what we can do to alleviate it. This story is from Yahoo Life by Caitlin Riley on May 20th, 2024.
So, the article actually begins by noting that loneliness is considered an epidemic in America. And according to the U.S. Surgeon General, despite this, the poll reveals that 50% of the respondents rarely or never feel lonely, which is a stark contrast that suggests a nuanced understanding is needed. And loneliness is not just about objective social isolation, but also about subjective feeling or connection and fulfillment. So, Jimmy, since you introduced us to the story, how do the top three factors contributing to feelings of loneliness actually show up among the survey respondents?
Well, I think that the difference in the definition of loneliness just goes to show, to your point, that loneliness is, in fact, a social understanding and not necessarily the definition that is understood by everybody. And people can experience their their social connection differently. I think for the elderly versus the youth to have such differing opinions, and then breaking that down to women, for example, who experience loneliness a lot differently than men and more frequently, just goes to show that we define loneliness a lot differently. And so for the young people who might socialize in different ways than the elderly, but still define loneliness by its textbook definition, I think they may be answering a question that they're not really being asked, you know? And so that was kind of my initial take on that. And you know, to relate this to religion, you know, we are the ACA after all. I thought that the decline in people saying they're religious versus the rise in people saying that they're lonely speaks to the fact that many people often turn to religion for social purposes. And with people turning away from religion, might be socializing less. That was kind of a connection I thought is worthy of more exploration. So I wanted to kind of posit that there. But as far as the factors breaking these differences down, different understandings of what it means to be lonely, you know, just seem to exist between different groups.
You know, I want to explore that whole thing that you brought up. Even though I was thinking about talking about it a little bit later, you know, when it comes to the decline of the, you know, religious being a thing and having a rise in the nons. We covered that a lot here on the nonprofits and how that could be a big contributing factor to how people socialize. So, Cindy, I'm coming to you. How do you think the decline of, you know, being like people saying that they're religious or attending like religious institutions, temples, churches, etc., actually can be a contributing factor to the possibility or the feeling of one being lonely?
I think there is an impact. I mean, I've been involved with the ACA for several years now, and I've seen and heard this topic since the very beginning. So we've talked a lot at the ACA about this, about the community aspect of religion and how atheists or non-religious people can combat this and offer an alternative. And we haven't found a real solution yet. Mm-hmm. What this poll struck me with is that I was under the impression that numbers were higher than what is shown here. And I wondered if maybe the pandemic had an impact on that, meaning that loneliness is basically it's like pain. It's something that you feel, and when you're asked about question, it can be influenced on how you feel at the moment, what you went through in the last hours, days, months, and so the fact that we've all been very much alone for almost a year, did it lower our threshold to feel loneliness? That's what I wondered when I read the study.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go back to the study and let's really talk about like the demographic differences. So the poll shows that significant differences in loneliness are based on age and gender. I believe, Jimmy, you brought up that point. Younger people, particularly those who happen to be Gen Z and millennials, report higher rates of loneliness, which could be linked to an increased social media usage and the pressure to maintain those online personas. And this demographic is reliance on virtual interactions may hinder deeper and more meaningful face-to-face connections. But, those who happen to be older, who have not been, I'm not going to say exposed, but they're not as reliant on building relationships with social media as much as like Gen Zers and millennials are, don't necessarily need that to be a divining rod per se, for lack of a better term, when it comes to defining like what their state of loneliness might be. So, Jimmy, I want you to kind of like, give your thoughts on how do you think that social media can play impact on how one might look at or even experience loneliness versus not. And then, Cindy, I would like for you to get your thoughts as well.
Well, when it comes to social media, it can be a very anxiety-inducing type of medium for somebody who sees photos and sees events taking place where people of their own age group, people of similar lifestyles, perhaps likes and dislikes, etc., are out having fun. They're with people. They're making something of themselves, if you will. But we have to remember that a lot of these lives, these personas that we see online are glimpses. They're the highlights. They are made up. The entire story is made up. Might be based on real events, but that's not the consistency of that person's story, right?
Right.
It's not easy to remember that, though, especially as a young person. I think that when you see these things, you measure yourself against that. And for the young people who are seeing other young people do this on social media, that might translate to loneliness. But I think older people from previous generations that were not enmeshed in social media can relate to that in some way. They came up with billboards and television, right, of people who maybe looked like them or reflected them in some way, but were doing better than them, keeping up with the Joneses, right? Right. Did I say that already? I'm not sure if I did. But in any case, it's a very real thing. So I just think that it didn't quite equate to loneliness for those people, right? Mm-hmm. Social media, on the other hand, is different in that aspect. Now it includes socialization, not just who's doing what, who's better off, who's well off, who's keeping up with the Joneses, if you will. Now it's who's keeping up with every Tom, Dick, and Harry in the neighborhood. It's a little bit different, and I think it translates differently between young people and older folks.
Do you think the keeping up the Joneses issue for online personas is a thing, Cindy? Like when you actually look at think of how younger people are relating to one another versus maybe older people?
I'm not sure that social media has such an importance on the difference between loneliness in young and older people. There are several factors that I'm not sure are taken into account. Like older people, they met more people during their lifetime, so they have more people to relate to when needed, and also those people they met, they are in their memories, in the way they think, and so loneliness is harder to trigger when you've met a lot of people during your lifetime. That's one thing. Another thing is that older people grew up without social media, and so they had to socialize differently. And so those social connections, they are probably more impactful in the way they measure their own loneliness. So I don't know. It's probably the case that some people who are lonely turn more towards social media, but I'm not entirely sure that social media is the cause of the problem.
Yeah, it just probably is just like a symptom or
Causation versus
yeah,
correlation thing.
correlation. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Thank you. Turtles all the way down. Regardless, it's kind of interesting. I'm going to go into a little anecdotal evidence when it comes to how I viewed this poll. With my line of work, I happen to deal with a lot of people who that are seniors. And when I do my assessments to see, what kind of resources they may need, a question that I always ask everybody is, are they lonely? And majority of the time, the seniors say no. Or they find other ways in order for them to engage with the community around them. And I will tell you, especially, with my Latine and my African American demographics, that the majority of them are Christian. The majority of them are attached to some type of, church, religious setting. A lot of them have community members that they speak with on a regular basis, and that is something that they use, I guess, to mitigate any type of loneliness that they may possibly experience. So is it that maybe us who happen to be irreligious, secular, not necessarily engaging in institutions like that, causing, I don't know if we can say correlation versus causation, an issue because our communities may not be as, connected, resourceful, or what have you. Jimmy, what are your thoughts about that? And then Cindy, I'd like for you to chime in as well.
Well, that's a good question, and it's kind of a tough one to ask because I don't feel like I'm lonely, and I don't go to church, of course, and I felt like when I was in church I didn't fit in, and none of that comfort, none of that socialization really made me want to be there. Mm-hmm. I think in that aspect it might just come down to feeling wanted, feeling connected. So there's probably a lot of people who go to church that equate socialization in that space with not being lonely, but they may still very well be lonely. I found you guys. I found the ACA. I get asked sometimes in my line of work, do you have a support network? Well, yeah, I think I do. I think that Cynthia, I think either one of you, Cindy, Cynthia, I could probably call you or contact you if I needed to talk or if I needed something. And that right there, I don't have to see you every Sunday, but I don't feel lonely because of that. Mm-hmm. So it's a sense of belonging that really matters, and it goes back to the point that I made earlier. Do people really know what they're answering when they ask when they are asked about being lonely, because maybe they're associating a different word with loneliness, a different definition. Maybe they don't feel like they belong, or maybe they don't feel adequate when compared to the rest of their social group. And that's what they're really defining. But as far as loneliness in religion versus non-religious, I really think it's about the company you keep and not the kind of company that you have to find. So that's my response there.
What about you, Cindy? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And also there is an idea of frame of reference. When you are born into a religious family and you're used to being surrounded by all your congregation every time you do something outside your house, and when you lose that, then yes, the frame of reference is that you don't have as many people as you had before. And so you may feel lonelier. But another person who has the exact same number of connections, but it's been like this for their entire life, they may not feel lonely. So it depends on how you grew up and what you've been exposed to. There's another important point that I think is worth mentioning is there's a woman who is interviewed in the article, and she said, I'm a firm believer that loneliness ultimately stems from a lack of a relationship with ourselves. The real work lies not in creating meaningful relationships with others, but starting with creating or building a healthy relationship with ourselves. And to come back to the divide between younger and older people and how they express feeling loneliness, we also know that younger people are more receptive and understanding of mental illnesses and mental issues. And so maybe the fact that we are more aware of our mental issues means that we may feel more lonely because of this. I think that's something to be looked into because, again, it's correlation and causation may not be applying here, but I think there's still something to test here, because if we have people who realize how inadequate they feel compared to their social group, and also the fact that we have more LGBTQIA people who identify as such in the younger population, then this sentence that this woman wrote, it makes much more sense.
Much more sense. Yeah.
And yeah, I think there's something to look into there.
You bring up a very interesting point about the divide in generations when it comes to being more aware of behavioral health and how that actually coincides with how we relate to ourselves and also how we relate to other people. And I would definitely say that, and this is just, from observation and even from looking at how younger generations of people, speak and relate to one another and even what they're aware of versus maybe like a boomer generation or a silent generation, they happen to seem to be more in touch and more empathetic per se when it comes to even themselves. Now, with that being said, can we kind of explore that just a little bit? I know that we're running out of time, but I think it's something that's really important to touch on is that whole being in touch with, be more aware of, behavioral health and mental issues and even being empathetic. Cindy, can you kind of expand on that a little bit? And then, Jimmy, I would like your response to that as well.
Yeah, I think the fact that more knowledge has been acquired in the last 30 years about psychology and neurobiology and neuroscience in general, that made us more aware of our not necessarily issues, but the way we think is much more programmed than we used to think. And so
Mm.
programmed in the way that it depends on what we went through. It depends on how we were raised. It depends on our genetics. It depends on so many factors. And so realizing this and realizing that it can have a lot of impact on ourselves and the way we treat others, then that's why we have some people now who are younger who realize this more, because we are in touch with medias that tell us this, and we learn more about this. Again, social media gives us access to so much knowledge, and
Mm-hmm.
the older people may not spend so much time on it, and then they learn less and stay stuck with the knowledge they had at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that has an impact here as well.
Hmm. What about you, Jimmy? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think the awareness of mental health issues certainly plays out in our youth versus generations where you just didn't talk about mental health, right? And I
Right.
think that is reflected in the answers to this survey. And
Mm.
I can see members of the youth who were surveyed who said, well, yeah, maybe I do feel lonely, and it's because of these reasons, where you have the elderly that are answering and saying, now I'm fine.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is something to be considered as well. There's a generational gap, not only in the way that we use technology or the way that we define loneliness, but even a willingness to acknowledge some of the stages that we are in, or some of the mindsets or placement that we have as far as our mentality goes. That also, I would venture to say, probably had an impact on the results of this survey.
Yeah, I think that you're right with that. I think that both of you all really hit the nail on the head about especially being aware of, your basically how human behavior works, because we have so